Hello and welcome to another episode of TWiML Talk, the podcast where I interview interesting people doing interesting things in machine learning and artificial intelligence. I'm your host, Sam Charrington. A few weeks ago, we celebrated the podcast's second anniversary and asked listeners to send us some ways that they've applied what they've learned on the podcast to their work. We've seen some great responses, and for those of you that did take the time to reach out, thanks so much. An example I've heard several times, including most recently from Kelvin Ross, who presented at the last meetup, is from folks who learned about and gone on to implement the LIME model explainability technique, which stands for Local Interpretable Model Agnostic Explanations, from my interview with Carlos Gestrin. One of our favorite comments on the anniversary page came from listener Yuri Gorin, who mentioned that something clicked for him after hearing Jeff Dean discuss embedding categorical features with Word2Vec. After listening to that podcast, he was able to implement that technique to represent various features in one of his models as dense vectors. Fast AI's Rachel Thomas also referenced the interview with Jeff in her recent blog post about that technique, which we'll link to in the show notes. In keeping with the theme of listener sharing, for today's show, I'm super excited to share this interview with Nick Osborn, a longtime listener of the show and leader of the Global Machine Learning Project Management Office at AES Corporation, a Fortune 200 power company. Nick and I met at my AI Summit a few weeks back, and after a brief chat about some of the things he was up to at AES, I knew that I needed to get him on the show. In this interview, Nick and I explore how AES is implementing machine learning across multiple domains at the company. We dig into several examples falling under the natural language, computer vision, and cognitive assets categories that he's established for his projects. Along the way, we cover some of the key podcast episodes that help Nick discover potentially applicable ML techniques and how those are helping his team broaden the use of machine learning at AES. This was a fun and informative conversation that has a lot to offer. Thanks so much, Nick. All right, let's do it. All right, everyone, I am on the line with Nick Osborn. Nick is the leader of the Global Machine Learning Project Management Office with AES. Nick, welcome to This Week in Machine Learning and AI.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Same here. So you are a longtime listener of the podcast who I finally had an opportunity to meet at my AI Summit a few weeks ago. And we got into a really interesting discussion about some of the things that you're working on at AES. So I'm really looking forward to digging into that. But before we do, why don't you give us an overview of how you got started working in machine learning and AI?
Sure. So my start in machine learning and AI is maybe a little bit different from the kind of the typical interviewee you have on, in that I've come from the business analyst side. So, my background is very much finance and consulting. I worked actually in restructuring, which is working with distressed businesses. But in that work, one of the things that we always ended up doing is a lot of analysis, a lot of work with big data sets. And so when I think about my background in kind of data science broadly, I think of it from that perspective, and really understanding the value that this type of analysis can add to a business. The real value it can add for an organization long term, and the real financial and practical business applications. So, from that background, and really over the last 5 years now, I have been working closely with the CTO of our organization to do various strategy initiatives. And one of those, about 2 years ago, actually a little more than 2 years ago now, we got started in looking at machine learning, AI, and advanced analytics. And really that effort has continued to where we are now. And so it's gone from just trying to understand the space to doing a series of pilots. And we've had some initial successes with our pilot efforts in practical applications, to now where we're really starting to dig in, and the company's making a more cognizant and more focused investment in upgrading our digital capabilities.
Fantastic. So I think it will help contextualize the discussion of the things that you're working on for folks to better understand AES and what the company's focus is.
Sure. So AES is a global power company. That's power generation. So we own power plants and utilities in 15 countries around the world. That's down. Our footprint's shrunk a little bit over the last several years, but we're now currently operating in 15 countries. We own generation assets that span the spectrum from solar, wind to natural gas and coal. We are making a very cognizant effort in the business to invest in greener technologies and transitioning more of our fleet away from coal to cleaner and a big focus on renewable energy. And I think one other thing to add in there is that we are the world's leader in battery energy storage.
What aspect of battery energy storage?
So we focus on primarily utility scale battery energy storage. So these are the grid facilities that go in. They're usually tens to hundreds of megawatts in scale. And they provide a spectrum of services for the grid, from balancing to frequency regulation. And really what we're starting to see now is that these energy storage assets can actually replace or take the place of a thermal or a natural gas peaking plant. So it's really one of the ways we are starting to shift the energy networks away from thermal to cleaner and more renewable technologies.
When you first started to think about applying machine learning and AI to AES's business, how did you think about it? Where did you think the opportunities were, and what was the initial driver?
Yeah, so I think at the very beginning, it was much more of a research effort. And then we kind of slowly began to add additional things that we saw that could be applicable, across the enterprise. And I think where we've gotten to and where our current thinking is that, AI could play a role really across the full spectrum of the enterprise, right? So we, currently we have projects going on in language, we have projects going on in vision. And then we have projects going on in a theme that we call cognitive assets, which is where we, try to bring intelligence to our machines, so our power plants, right? And that's where we get into maybe the clearest or the first area that maybe came to mind was how could we make our power plants more efficient? How could we operate them more effectively over the long term? And that's where we get into predictive analytics type initiatives and projects. But really, we're looking across the full breadth of the organization, from HR to strategy. Being in generation, safety is a critical piece of how we operate. And so we've had a few projects take a look at safety and how we can improve safety using AI techniques.
Before we go to your first projects, you mentioned that the initial emphasis was research and really learning. How did you go about that learning phase of this?
Well, Sam, I would say your podcast was
that wasn't a softball.
No, but seriously, this podcast was a great way to learn about the industry, and really going back to your tagline, interesting people doing interesting things in machine learning, and that's really the role it played for me, and I know several other people in the company listen to the podcast as well. And it was really a great way to get exposed. I mean, there's so much activity in the space right now, and the filtering and the interview you do with kind of key people in each of these businesses was a great way for us to get our heads around the breadth of everything going on, and maybe even give us a little bit of focus on the companies that were doing, the actual interesting work or some of the interesting work. So.
Mm-hmm. And how about coursework? Have various people in the company taken or pursued kind of formal coursework in the area or research efforts?
So yeah, people have been doing coursework formally and informally. We were lucky to have a few people who actually had some data science as part of their graduate studies, and so that was very helpful. But people have been working through the Andrew Ng's Coursera work. I know I've taken a look at some of the stuff on edX and whatnot, and then we've also been just using using some of the some of the free tutorials that are available, like through Azure and through some of the other platforms, and really trying to focus on getting people's hands dirty with these tools. Mm-hmm. That's something that we actually have done a number of times now, where we lead what we call cohorts, which are about a month long, where we focus on getting people hands-on with machine learning tools. So we've used things like the Azure platform. We've gotten people into Google and then some of their tools in TensorFlow. We've done work with Cortical and some of the free APIs they have, and getting people to use them. IBM Bluemix, we did work with some of their cognitive tools, and just really trying to get people past reading about it and getting people to use some of these tools and see how they work and see how people can interact with them. And that's been something that's been very helpful for people in the company.
Awesome. So you mentioned Cortical, and this was a great story that you told me at the AI Summit. And I guess it ties to that language, that first of the three main areas that you've dug into. Maybe can you start by talking a little bit about where you see the use cases for NLP, NLU types of technologies and language, and then some of the things that you've done?
Sure. So I think language in particular is one of the ones where we see some broad applications. And so just initially, we've done some piloting and some testing. Language is actually one of the areas where we've done some work around safety and seeing if we can, improve safety or find some predictive capabilities through language. And so that's one area, and I can go into more depth if you want on that. But we're also looking at strategy. I think there's a number of possibilities within HR. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for AI and machine learning to help with the recruiting and the evaluation of candidates through the resume submissions. And then a lot of my current thinking is around the strategy effort and how can we, understand the exponential content that is going out there or that is coming in, and really provide a meaningful way to understand that content and to get it in front of our decision makers in a timely and relevant fashion.
So maybe start with safety and take us a little deeper into what you've done and what you're hoping to achieve there.
Yeah, so safety actually ended up not being one of our more successful projects.
Okay.
But the way we work is, are one of the things that we do throughout our company are things called safety walks, and we also do a lot of just safety monitoring, where people go out and they will document any safety findings throughout the company. And so one of the things that we are hoping to do is, could we look at that data set? It's a written data set, to understand if there were any triggers or identifiers in those data sets that could lead us to understanding either really, really good safety environments or versus poor safety environments. And
what would be an example of a trigger or identifier that you might expect to correlate to safety?
Yeah, and maybe some of that's why that project wasn't as successful, is trying to understand the way people are talking about safety and the words that they're using are writing about the safety of their facilities or plants, right? So it was a bit nebulous, and we didn't get super far on that project before it was kind of deemed not super feasible. However, so maybe switching over to areas where we did make a little more progress was we did, and this was one of the projects we did with Cortical, or using some of the tools from Cortical. But we also do periodic culture surveys throughout the organization. And so, we're a global company with a lot of people. So we received 13,000 surveys back in our last cultural survey effort. Most of that is multiple choice. But we also had 4 open entry text fields that people could respond to 4 questions we were posing. So, which ended up with us receiving about 30,000 written responses, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a lot of just data for anyone to kind of sort through or mine through. It's very hard to be consistent in that evaluation, even if one person read it all. And so what we used the tool from Cortical, and what we did a number of different analyses, but what we were looking to do is benchmark those statements against 60 other statements that we had. And so one of the things that Cortical allows you to do is compare 2 different text documents or text fields, paragraphs, or whatever, and compare them on a semantic level, right? So this is where you get your overlap between the 2. And basically by understanding the overlap, we were able to benchmark the responses that we were getting against a series of 60 criteria, which are helping us to evaluate the culture in each of our facilities. And so since each of those responses came back with the demographic information, not anything identifiable to an individual, but with kind of broad demographics, male, female, kind of rough age ranges and those sort of things, we were able to kind of peel the onion a little bit deeper and try to identify on a comparative basis, which locations are, caring about different parts of our culture, right? So just an example here is, one facility could really care about advancement opportunities, other facilities could care about benefits, and this was a way for us to really mine that 30,000 comments or questions that we received back to really understand the business on a deeper level, and so. So that was one part of the analysis. We also pulled in some additional tools. We pulled in.
And before you get too far from this particular piece, part of what was exciting for me to hear from you was that you initially came across the work that Cortical was doing around their semantic folding and semantic NLP stuff. Yeah. Through the podcast, actually, TWiML Talk number 10 with their founder, Francisco Weber. Is that right?
Yeah. So that is where we first learned about it. And I want to say you also had a talk with Numenta on later, which is kind of the founding company, or the research institute. But yeah, so TWiML Talk 10 with Francisco Weber I found it to be incredibly fascinating. One of the other people in our company also listened to that podcast and also found it really interesting. And we kind of kept bringing it up to the CTO of our organization on this is different. The way they are thinking about language is just fundamentally different than a lot of the other language tools that we had seen. And at the time, we had also spent a fair amount of effort looking into the IBM tools and just saw this as something really different and something that, to me, just kind of fundamentally makes more sense in the understanding of language. So I found it to be really interesting.
And for this particular project, it sounds like you had good results in understanding these survey responses. Did you come up with a measure of, the results or how good the results were? And had you tried other approaches previously that, were that you also measured and could compare the success?
So no. So we didn't do a comparative analysis against a different tool, but The speed we were able to work through on the tool was much faster than what we were seeing with other tools.
Okay.
And our ability to use it, and we were primarily using just the free API and doing some coding on our side to make it all work and manipulate the data into it.
Mm-hmm.
But it worked great. We didn't. There wasn't an easy precision type measure that we could get, but we spent a fair amount of time validating it, just one-on-one, going through the responses and seeing the comparison that it was providing or the prediction that it was providing through the tool, and making sure that it lined up with what we were seeing. So we did a fair amount of data testing or testing, once we had worked through the tool, but we didn't have a defined prediction measure for it.
Awesome. And I cut you off. You were about to mention other tools, I think you were saying, that you were looking at?
Yeah, so we used some other tools to bring in sentiment analysis into it, right? So running the same question through a tool to get sentiment, so positive, negative sentiment, and the emotional state that was coming back. So that was, again, that's just providing another layer of information on it, so we could, understand whether or not people were talking positively or negatively about management versus just saying, oh, that person's, talking about management.
Okay.
And so that was a helpful layer to add in there. And then the second big piece of the analysis was trying to pull out what we were calling the meta nouns and meta adjectives from the sentences, which were the primary topics and the primary descriptors of the topics that were being used in those statements. And so if you think about the different ways a person could talk about, their boss, right? It could be their leader, it could be manager, it could be, a lot of different descriptors. And so we were able to pull out what we were terming meta nouns and meta adjectives and combine them together to what we were terming at the time caveman speak, which was, stuff like, management good, development bad, right? Or something along those lines, right? So really basic understanding of the thematic content of the responses. And again, that helped us really narrow down what was being said, because then we could look at across the organization or across the sample that we are working with on, what were the key things that people were saying, right? So trying to replicate how a human would go through that data set and, pull out the major themes. And, and this is exactly what we saw when we talked to the actual humans who were going through it, as they were going through and they were, basically tick marking every time that they came across, a response with a particular topic in it. And so we tried to use the cortical tool to basically do the same thing for us, is provide us an understanding of the topics that were coming back in the responses.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
And so you've mentioned safety. You've mentioned this. I kind of am assuming that is the AHR use case. And you mentioned strategy as well, which it sounds like that is related to kind of content management is not the right word, but kind of content understanding, I guess. Talk a little bit about that strategy use case and what you did there.
Yeah, so this is one of the ones where we're still working, and we had a fair amount of success at the end of last year, and we're kind of reevaluating next steps on this project. But basically, what we were able to do is we built a scraper to go scrape, and we limited where we were scraping the information from for this pilot, but we were able to pull out new news articles from a data source. We were then able to evaluate those news articles against, and we were going down to the paragraph level, but we were pulling out comparing those news articles against specific strategic scenarios that we were foreseeing in the next 3 to 5 years for that space. And so, we had gone through in an effort of, putting together a red scenario, green scenario, blue scenario, that we were comparing these news articles against, right? So we were able to say, does this, news article line up with our green scenario, which maybe our green scenario is, full transition to clean energy, right? And these are just very theoretical examples, and so we were able to kind of understand, what the news article was about, categorize it against a strategic outcome that we saw, in the next 3 to 5 years. And then what we also did is we built in the ability to present this to a user. So we built a little Slack interface to present the news article and the prediction to a user, and to find out whether or not they agreed or disagreed with our prediction. And then we use that prediction to further hone our initial pick or prediction.
Okay. Were you using any particular tools as part of that, or did you develop the tooling for that internally?
Yeah, we were working with Cortical's API again for that one.
Okay.
But we built a lot of the other tooling was done in-house. I think we were using Scrapey to do the actual web, crawl and scrape function.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
which I've heard great things about.
Yeah, it worked really well. It was very quick for us to get up and running. I didn't do the actual work with it, but it was fast and easy. So those are good things.
Okay. Cool. So that's some of the things that you've done on the language side of things. Mm-hmm. How about vision? Yeah,
so vision's really interesting. And that's one of the areas we're currently pretty active on. So maybe one thing, Sam, we did really early on, and this was just another example of where your podcast came in, but you did an interview with Clarify with Matt Zeller.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were able to, just using, again, the free tooling from Clarify, we were able to prove out a use case in safety where we could detect hard hats, right? So we could detect whether or not people were wearing their PPE, their personal protective equipment. And I mean, it's like built in, the tool just does it for you automatically. And so we were able to prove out really quickly that, yeah, this is something that we could do, is, basically set up a camera to detect whether or not people are wearing their hard hats or their work gloves or work boots. Right. But, yeah, I mean, it was a really easy tool just to get up and running. We haven't pursued that use case. But yeah, I mean, really just another example of kind of one of the ways, we listened to the podcast, learned about a company, and then tried to, check it out and bring it into a business application.
Awesome. And so what else have you done on the vision front?
So right now we are working heavily on a project where we are trying to detect damage in drone inspection footage, and so we have some good data sets that we're working on, and we're currently primarily working with Google on this effort. But we're looking at some other applications or potential applications. But Google's been really helpful in working with us. We're hoping to do a few more projects in the coming weeks, but where this project started off is we started off with TensorFlow and with the inception model there. And that's specifically for our use case, which was this damage detection project. We were able to, prove out that it worked. Our initial couple models were working, but we were getting problems with high false positive rates. So that's really where we've focused in now. We're spending a lot of time working on our labeling. And so the labeling has been a big part of the data cleanup. And I'm sure it's not a surprise for anyone who's worked in data science that getting your data set correct is incredibly important, especially when the data set wasn't necessarily built for data science, right? It was the data set we were starting from it was built for humans and for human inspectors to understand what was going on with the pictures. And so it's messy and inconsistent.
What's an example of the kind of damage that you were looking to determine, and what specifically did that data set look like?
Sure. So our data set right now is, we own wind facilities across the United States. We have three primary projects and about 500 turbines in the U.S. And so the data set we are looking at is the inspection footage of those blades. And just for sizing, each of the three facilities, when we do an inspection, we'll come back between 10 and 20,000 images of those inspections. And this is primarily blade inspections, right? And so these are images taken via drone of the blades while they're stopped. They take pictures of all aspects, so the four kind of different directions of the blade. So, the high pressure side, low pressure side, leading and trailing edges. The damage can be surprising, for a turbine blade that, is kind of just going through air. There's a lot of different damage types that we see. This can, be like erosion, and so some of our facilities are in very arid or desert landscapes, and there's a fair amount of dust and particulate matter, so you can get erosion. You can get bird strikes, so birds hitting the turbine blades, which can do a fair amount of damage. Lightning strikes, and so you will see things from small divots and dents and coating penetrations to kind of large scale delamination of sections of a blade. And so that's the data set. And then traditionally, so if we go backwards a little bit, Sam, so before drones, these inspections were done manually. So someone would climb up the tower and then go down and look for damage that way. So dangerous, time-consuming work. When we switched over to drones, that was a tremendous time saver, but had the side effect on, well, now someone has to review 10 to 20,000 images.
Right.
Right.
And the drones are capturing still images or video?
So in this application, it's still, but we actually have a drone partner that we work with, Measure, and so they can do different image types. They can do video, or my understanding is they can do video and infrared, and so infrared infrared's actually really important for solar applications, and it's the infrared's a really great way to spot problems on a solar field.
And I'm assuming that the drones are manually operated as opposed to, autonomously kind of going through a field of turbines?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, this is all, they're all manually flown. They fly a defined flight pattern when they do the inspections, but yeah, it's all manual. And
so you started with TensorFlow, and there's been the main issue you're focusing on now is addressing some issues with your labeling. How was the labeling done previously? Are these the either your engineers or the drone providers kind of manually writing up a report of some sort, or are they coded or something? Where were you starting?
Yeah, so it's changed and it's changing. So it started off, pretty rudimentary on just people entering information in an Excel worksheet as they were going through the images. Our drone partner that we work with now has some tools to allow them to be kind of more to be bounding boxes and to be systematically labeled with very defined categories, and so that's helping us really get where we need to go on the labeling side, or we hope will get us where we need to go on the labeling side. So yeah, we're working on getting consistent labels, getting those damage instances bounded to help, which we think will be helpful.
And I'm curious, have you explored in either this use case or any of the others active learning? Specifically meaning, so you train a model based on some set of data, and then you have incremental You basically have a human kind of correct a model's decision on an incremental basis and feed that back into the model training. Have you done anything at all with that?
Actually, we just kind of looked at that maybe starting last week. Right?
Okay.
So we've kind of switched over to using AutoML with Google.
Okay.
And so that has some of that functionality built right in. And so that's how we're proceeding on that path. Is I won't say we've done much with it yet, but that's part of the plan at this point. Once we kind of got our heads around that, like, we were really excited. Yeah.
I mean, it's potentially interesting, and I'm hearing some interesting stories of folks starting to see good results with it. All right, cool. Are there any other vision use cases that you've looked at?
Not that we're actively working on, but I think the applications for drone inspection footage is something that we're kind of looking at broadly.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different use cases within the power space and the utility space in general. So
I can imagine.
Yeah. So it's dangerous work. It's high voltages, high pressures. So anytime we can take a human, like a remote, or take them out of that situation, is generally seen as a positive thing, and drones are a big part of that.
And then the flip side of that is taking advantage of the onboard sensor data to predict machine failure, and that kind of leads us to that third category of cognitive assets. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing there?
Yeah, so cognitive assets is a bit of a broad category for us, where we look at a number of prediction type capabilities there, and really looking at that, anomaly detection in a facility, predictive maintenance, and those sort of things. But we've also been able to do some tuning of our assets, and that's really where we've seen the most progress. And so this is one of the ones I think I mentioned to you at the Interop conference, but I'm sure you're familiar with the Google data center use case, where they were able to, I believe, improve PUE by 40%.
That's right. And yeah. PUE is the power something efficiency?
Correct. Yeah. So, it's not the exact same application, but when you think about our battery energy storage facilities, they are very similar to a data center, just without the compute, right? They're just big, they're racks and racks of batteries. And so we were able to, develop a model that first predicted our power usage and power efficiency. And then we were able to use that model to then improve power efficiency. And I believe where last update I had is we were able to show a 20% improvement in efficiency, with an algorithm that we built largely trying to, copy Google's work in the area. And so that's something that has now moved on into our energy storage business. And our energy storage business got spun out over this past year into a new enterprise called Fluence, with partnering with Siemens, and so its own joint venture. And they've taken that project and they continue to run with it and run with deeper applications of machine learning on their what they call their Advancion software.
Interesting. So can you talk a little bit about the how that project evolved, and the data assessment and collection phase, the modeling phase? How did you dig into it, and how did you get started with it, really?
So, yeah, I mean, it started off just, getting access to the data. And so one of the great things about our energy storage facilities is that they're digitally native. And so all the control systems have been digital since the very beginning. And so we have literally, tens of terabytes of information just from our energy storage assets. And so that's a tremendous data set for people to start working with. One of the things that we were, or one of the initial kind of difficulties we came across, is that we had always had like a single set point on our basically our HVAC system, right? So we didn't have a very diverse data set on how to manipulate our HVAC system, right? So it had always had a fixed set point, and so one of the things that we had done is we did modify our control software to allow some variability in that HVAC setting, and so that was kind of one of the initial things that we had to work through on getting a more meaningful data set for our modeling effort. And really, once we got beyond there, it kind of all kind of clicked into place on improving our predictive capability on our model, and then being able to use that model to tune the system.
And so was the HVAC system the primary system that you were controlling to increase power efficiency, or was it something related to the batteries themselves or something else?
Yeah, no, it was primarily the HVAC system. So we were really focused on what we call in the power industry our auxiliary load, which is it's basically the power we use to make power, right? And
right.
That's kind of that's what we were really focusing on. And anytime we can reduce that aux load means we can put more of that power into the marketplace, and it's really an efficiency thing for power plants.
And do you have a sense for, off the top of your head, what that 20% improvement translates into from a business perspective in terms of dollars per year or X per X?
Yeah, I don't have a good figure for that, but it's got to be it's meaningful. It's meaningful. I don't know what the dollar impact is though.
Maybe taking a step back from these three use case categories, mm-hmm. I'm curious if you can speak to running a ML PMO in an organization that has another business. Your business isn't, you're not a software company, machine learning company, anything like that. Like, how do you approach portfolio management of all these individual efforts, and how do you see that evolving as you gain maturity?
Sure. So, early on, when I worked with our CTO on defining what the PMO would do and what my role would be, the role was really to facilitate, coordinate, and accelerate these projects. And so, being such a distributed business, it was really important that we help the businesses foster their own projects and help them find resources they need and open their eyes to some of the capabilities, but to allow for some organic growth and or organic direction from the businesses. So that was one area where we've really tried to, I don't want to say be hands off, but instead of directing each of our businesses to do something with ML, we've tried to kind of open their eyes to the technology and to be available to them to help foster or to help facilitate any of these projects coming forward. That said, we've also taken the lead on several projects, right? So we couldn't let everything just be, wait to come to us. So we kind of took a dual approach where we've led some projects, but then we've also put a fairly cognizant effort into raising awareness of ML technologies and tools and the business applications and the potential to our senior leaders and to really some broad user groups across the company. So trying to raise awareness while also trying to show some successes with our pilots.
And do you have any advice or kind of lessons learned, from that perspective, the portfolio perspective, or the introducing ML and AI to a large organization perspective that you would share with folks that are maybe similarly situated but earlier on in the process?
Sure. Well, I think the biggest thing is to talk about it and to communicate. I think just in general, that's the biggest thing that I find between successful efforts and non-successful efforts. This goes well before my time at AES. Is the clarity of that communication across the organization is key. We've really tried to get our senior leaders on board, and I've seen some really great commitment by our our COO in particular, and even our CEO, and talking about the capabilities and the need for our business to be to move kind of higher up the digital mastery curve, and with machine learning and AI being central to that. And so getting that executive buy-in is always critical. But then really starting to talk, down in the business where stuff tends to happen, right? So the executive support is really important, but there's people who are, working in this data on a day-to-day basis, who have some incredible, subject matter expertise and some incredible fundamental knowledge of how the data works. And getting those people engaged has been really important as well, because those are the people that usually end up doing the work, and getting them excited about it has been a great avenue for us.
That's fantastic. Well, congratulations on the success you've seen with these projects. It sounds like you're doing really incredible work. Is there anything else that you'd want to leave folks with?
Maybe just, I'm really committed to the value of digital and the incredible power that analytics can add to a business. I've seen firsthand the value it can drive, in a variety of industries and businesses. And I'd just would highly recommend to business people out there that, they spend the time to understand the technology, to demystify it, because I think that's something that, a lot of people, if they're just reading kind of the news headlines, are kind of focused on the kind of the mystical aspect. But at the end of the day, this is just these are just more tools that you can have in your tool belt, and really drive a lot of value in your organization. For sure. Well, Nick, thank you so much for taking the time and really for being so open with what you've been able to share with us. I'm sure it's going to be very helpful to folks. Yeah, no, I'm really excited to be here and talk with people about it. And, I hope to be able to share some more stuff in the future. Awesome. Thank you.
All right, everyone, that's our show for today. For more information on Nick or any of the topics covered in this episode, head on over to twimlai.com/talk/150. As always, thanks so much for listening, and catch you next time.